Stop saying I can't afford it. Not because it's negative, but because it's a confession. You're not describing money. You're announcing who you are, and money is responding to the identity speaking. Most people believe poverty announces itself loudly through empty bank accounts or overdue bills, but it almost never does. It whispers instead, casually, socially, through a phrase so normalized that no one questions it. I can't afford it. It sounds responsible. It sounds mature. It even sounds intelligent. Yet this sentence is not a description of circumstance. It is a quiet confession of identity. It is not about money at all. It is about who the speaker believes themselves to be in relation to life, supply, and possibility. And the tragedy is that the phrase feels harmless precisely because it is shared, repeated, and socially approved, which is why it locks people into lack far more effectively than fear ever could. This is where the teaching of Neville Goddard becomes uncomfortable for the modern mind. Neville was uncompromising on one point. Inner speech is never neutral. Every word you habitually say about yourself, aloud or silently, is a confession of state. You are always declaring who you are being. When someone says, I can't afford it, they are not merely describing a temporary choice. They are announcing a position in consciousness. They are identifying as someone to whom provision does not naturally flow. And consciousness, once identified, does not argue. It accepts, it organizes, it confirms. Money, contrary to popular belief, does not respond to politeness, effort, or even need. It responds to identity. It moves toward the one who assumes it, not the one who explains why they lack it. Neville often pointed out that no one announces what they do not have unless they believe that absence defines them. You don't walk into a room declaring you lack oxygen. You don't introduce yourself by listing what you're missing. Absence only becomes verbal when it has become personal, when it has fused with self-concept. That is why this phrase is so revealing. It exposes a belief that limitation is not situational, but structural. Modern neuroscience has stumbled into the same truth using different language. Joe Dispenza explains that repeated self-talk is not just language, it is instruction. The brain wires around what you consistently tell it to expect. When a sentence is repeated often enough, it stops being a thought and becomes an assumption. And once it becomes an assumption, behavior follows automatically. Choice is narrow, opportunities feel unrealistic, desire shrinks to match identity, not because life is cruel, but because the subconscious is obedient. So when people ask why money feels distant, why it never quite arrives, why it seems to slip through their fingers no matter how hard they try, the answer is rarely found in strategy. It is found in confession. One sentence, spoken casually, rehearsed silently, accepted as truth, is enough to signal to life exactly how to treat you. This video is not about shaming language or forcing affirmations. It is about exposing the embarrassing reason money appears to run from certain people and showing how quickly everything changes when that confession stops. Money doesn't hear words, it reads state. There is a subtle misunderstanding that quietly undermines most people's relationship with money, and it begins with the belief that language itself is the creative power. People assume that if they choose the right words, soften their tone, or sound responsible enough, life will somehow respond differently. But money has never responded to vocabulary. It has never been impressed by politeness, explanations, or even honesty. What it responds to is the state from which the words emerge. The same sentence spoken from two different identities carries two completely different signals, and money reads that signal instantly, without analysis or emotion. Think of it this way. A bank does not approve a loan because the applicant speaks confidently or explains their situation well. It approves based on a profile, a history, an identity formed by patterns. The tone of voice does not matter if the underlying state says high risk. In the same way, money does not respond to how nicely you say, I can't afford it, or how justified your reasoning feels. Polite lack talk is still lack talk. It still broadcasts the same inner profile. It still announces that the speaker is operating from a state where supply is conditional, limited, and uncertain. This is why Neville Goddard was relentless in emphasizing feeling over phrasing. He did not teach people to manipulate words. He taught them to occupy states. Feeling, in Neville's language, was never emotion alone. It was the inner sense of being someone for whom a thing is natural. When that state is assumed, language changes automatically without effort. When the state is not assumed, no amount of verbal refinement can disguise it. The subconscious and life itself are not fooled by manners. What makes this difficult for people to accept is that it removes blame from the outside world and places responsibility squarely on identity. If money were reacting to words alone, one could simply swap phrases and expect results. But when money reacts to state, the question becomes more confronting. Who is the one speaking? From what position in consciousness are these sentences arising? A sentence does not create poverty. A state does. The sentence merely reveals it. This is why certain phrases expose someone instantly, even when spoken casually. They act like a financial fingerprint. They reveal whether the speaker is oriented toward provision or protection, assumption or defense. And once you understand that money is responding to who is speaking rather than what is being said, an uncomfortable realization emerges. Some sentences are not descriptions at all. They are declarations. And money listens very closely to declarations of identity. At first glance, the sentence seems harmless, even sensible. It presents itself as a statement of practicality, a mature acknowledgement of limits, a way of staying grounded in reality. Yet beneath its reasonable tone lies something far more revealing. "I can't afford it" is not a report of numbers. It is a declaration of self. It does not describe a moment. It defines a position. And once spoken, it subtly informs the subconscious who you believe you are in relation to money. Imagine walking through life wearing a name tag you forgot you put on. You don't notice it anymore because it has been there so long, but everyone else responds to it immediately. That is what this phrase does internally. It labels the speaker as someone for whom limitation is expected, not temporary, not circumstantial, structural. The subconscious does not hear nuance. It does not hear context. It hears identity. And when a sentence is repeated often enough, it stops being interpreted as a choice and starts being accepted as a permanent description of the self. This is why the phrase is so powerful. It doesn't say, "I'm choosing not to buy this right now." It says, "I am someone who does not have access." It collapses time and possibility into a fixed identity. The subconscious mind, which operates through assumption rather than logic, receives that identity without question. It reorganizes perception around it. Opportunities that contradict it feel unrealistic. Desires that exceed it feel irresponsible. Behavior quietly reshapes itself to remain consistent with the label. Neville Goddard made it clear that every assumption hardens into fact if left unchallenged, not because the world is rigid, but because consciousness is loyal. Once an identity is assumed, life arranges itself to confirm it. The individual does not consciously decide to sabotage themselves. They simply begin acting in ways that feel natural to the state they have confessed. Choices narrow, risks feel threatening, expansion feels foreign. This is how a sentence becomes a destiny without anyone noticing. The words feel small, but the confession is enormous. And once identity is assumed, behavior reorganizes around it effortlessly, silently, and consistently, ensuring that the world continues to reflect exactly what was declared. Lack talk creates repulsion, not absence. What most people interpret as loss is rarely loss at all. Money is not disappearing from their lives. It is avoiding the state they consistently occupy. This distinction is crucial because absence suggests punishment or failure, while avoidance suggests incompatibility. Money does not argue with consciousness. It does not try to convince, correct, or rescue. It simply circulates where it feels coherent. When the inner atmosphere is heavy with apology, justification, and need, circulation quietly collapses. Consider how people instinctively respond to someone who seems uncomfortable simply existing. Not someone who is temporarily struggling, but someone whose entire presence feels apologetic. Opportunities hesitate, invitations thin out, energy withdraws, not out of cruelty, but out of discomfort. In the same way, money avoids the state that announces insufficiency. Lack talk does not repel money because money is offended. It repels because the state behind it is constrictive. It signals tightness, fear, and contraction. Circulation cannot thrive there. Needy consciousness does something subtle and destructive. It collapses flow by overemphasizing the gap. Attention becomes glued to what is missing rather than to what is assumed. Desire becomes strained, expectation becomes anxious, and anxiety, no matter how well disguised, communicates instability. Money, like all forms of movement, gravitates towards stability. It seeks the state that assumes its presence, not the one that explains its absence. This is why Neville Goddard insisted that states attract their likeness. A state of abundance attracts opportunities, ideas, and pathways that feel abundant. A state of lack attracts circumstances that confirm limitation, not because the universe is testing you, but because consciousness is mirroring itself. What feels like bad luck is often perfect correspondence. The inner posture and the outer pattern are in agreement. Once this is understood, the struggle to get money begins to look misguided. The issue was never that money was gone. It was that the state being lived in was one money could not comfortably occupy. And when that state shifts, not through effort, but through assumption, the repulsion dissolves. Money stops avoiding. Circulation resumes, not because anything was forced, but because coherence was restored. If this is reshaping how you hear money, subscribe. There is a noticeable quietness around money when it is no longer a question of survival. People who live from a settled sense of provision do not narrate their financial reality to the world, and they do not constantly translate their choices through the lens of affordability. This is not secrecy and it is not performance. It is simply that money is no longer the central reference point for decision-making. When provision is assumed, attention moves elsewhere. Life is approached through preference, relevance, and timing, rather than through constant financial self-assessment. Affordability is a language of tension. It implies that money is something that must be checked, consulted, or negotiated with before action can occur. For someone rooted in a wealthy state of consciousness, that tension is absent. Not because they never consider cost, but because cost does not define them. It is a factor, not an identity. The absence of commentary is revealing. There is no inner need to announce limits, because limits are not being experienced as personal truths. Consider again the simple act of choosing a meal. When someone is preoccupied with scarcity, the choice is loud internally. There is calculation, justification, and often guilt layered into the decision. The mind rehearses reasons, prepares explanations, and anticipates regret. But when provision is assumed, the choice is quiet. It emerges without emotional charge. The individual does not feel the need to explain themselves to the waiter, to their companion, or to their own conscience. Silence replaces narration because there is nothing to defend. This silence is often misunderstood by those who are still operating from lack. It can appear careless or detached. In reality, it is grounded. It reflects a mind that is not scanning for threat. When money is no longer framed as fragile, the nervous system relaxes. Decisions stop feeling consequential in a fearful way. They become ordinary, and ordinary is powerful because what feels ordinary to the mind is what it allows consistently. The wealthy state is marked by this sense of normalcy. There is no dramatic emphasis on spending or saving, no moral weight attached to desire, no compulsive restraint. The inner speech is simple, almost boring. And that simplicity is precisely what allows flow. Money does not circulate easily where every choice is charged with anxiety or self-judgment. It circulates where decisions are made cleanly, without internal resistance. This is why the habit of declaring affordability issues is so revealing. It exposes a consciousness that is still negotiating with life, still trying to justify its position, still orienting around protection rather than assumption. The declaration is not for others. It is for the self. It is a reassurance spoken aloud to maintain coherence with a limited identity. Neville Goddard consistently pointed to this naturalness as the true marker of an assumed state. When something is assumed, it stops being discussed. It no longer requires verbal reinforcement. The moment someone feels compelled to announce lack, they are revealing that lack is still active within them as a definition, not a circumstance. This is why wealthy inner speech often sounds like silence. Not forced silence, not repression, but the absence of internal debate. When provision is assumed first, words fall away on their own. And in that quiet, money finds no argument, no tension, and no reason to resist. Thinking from supply, not about prices. There is a profound difference between thinking about money and thinking from supply, and most people never notice the distinction. Thinking about prices keeps attention anchored to limitation, measurement, and negotiation. It frames life as a sequence of transactions that must be survived carefully. Thinking from supply, on the other hand, begins from the assumption that provision is already in place. The mind is no longer stationed at the question of, "Can I?" but moves directly into, "What do I choose?" This shift is subtle, but it reorganizes perception completely. When someone lives in the end, as Neville Goddard described it, they are not fantasizing about outcomes or ignoring reality. They are operating from an inner conclusion. The end is not an event in the future, it is a position in consciousness. From that position, questions that once dominated the mind dissolve naturally. How will I pay? Loses relevance, because the state already assumes payment. Negotiation disappears because the conclusion has already been accepted internally. A useful way to sense this difference is to imagine shopping with a prepaid account versus counting cash at the register. When the account is prepaid, attention is relaxed. Choices are made based on preference and usefulness, not on fear of insufficiency. The mind is not tracking every movement anxiously. When counting cash, however, every decision is tense. The mind hovers over the numbers, anticipating loss, calculating risk, bracing for regret. Both scenarios may involve the same items and the same prices, but the inner experience is entirely different. Thinking from supply produces a similar calm. The individual is no longer mentally rehearsing worst-case scenarios. They are not internally arguing with themselves about responsibility or restraint. The background tension that accompanies lack simply is not there. This does not mean reckless behavior. It means that action arises from sufficiency rather than fear. And fear is what collapses creativity, timing, and flow. One of the clearest signs that someone is thinking about prices rather than from supply is the persistence of internal questioning. The mind keeps returning to logistics, to justification, to reassurance. There is a sense of chasing money, even in thought. When the state shifts, the chase stops. Questions lose urgency. The mind becomes quieter, more decisive, more neutral. This neutrality is not indifference, it is trust in an assumed foundation. Neville emphasized that assumption removes negotiation. As long as the mind is negotiating, it has not accepted the end. Negotiation implies doubt. It implies that the outcome is still undecided, but once the end is assumed, behavior aligns effortlessly. Choices feel simpler, timing feels less pressured. The individual is no longer trying to force money to appear. They are moving as someone for whom money already has a place. This is why thinking from supply feels like relief rather than excitement. There is no adrenaline in it. There is no emotional spike. It feels ordinary, almost uneventful. And that ordinariness is precisely what allows it to stabilize. Money does not respond to urgency. It responds to settled expectation. When supply is assumed, the inner environment becomes coherent, and coherence is what allows circulation to resume without resistance. Inner speech is the real conversation. Long before words are spoken aloud, a quieter dialogue is already underway. This inner conversation runs continuously beneath awareness, commenting, reacting, interpreting, and concluding. It is not dramatic, and it is rarely intentional, which is why it is so powerful. What you say internally, especially in moments of privacy and emotional honesty, carries far more creative weight than anything you declare publicly. Outward speech is often edited. Inner speech is not. This silent dialogue functions like background music in a room. No one may consciously notice it, yet it determines the atmosphere completely. A room filled with soft, steady music feels safe and coherent. A room filled with discordant noise feels tense, even if no one can pinpoint why. In the same way, inner speech sets the emotional and perceptual tone of your life. It colors how opportunities are perceived, how risks are evaluated, and how money is experienced. The outer world responds not to what you say when you are trying to sound composed, but to what you say when no one is listening. This is why spoken affirmations often fail when inner reactions remain unchanged. A person may say confident words during the day, yet silently flinch at prices, feel a tightening in the chest when money is mentioned, or immediately retreat into mental explanations of why something is out of reach. These reactions are not verbal, but they are communicative. They signal the true state. and the subconscious, which governs behavior and expectation, listens only to that signal. Neville Goddard placed enormous emphasis on this inner talking. He observed that people live in the end of the conversations they habitually rehearse within themselves. These conversations form a private narrative about who they are and what is possible for them. Over time, that narrative hardens into assumption. Once assumed, it no longer feels like a belief. It feels like reality. What makes inner speech so decisive is its emotional immediacy. It arises automatically in response to life. A bill arrives, a price is seen, an opportunity appears, and the inner voice responds instantly, before logic has time to intervene. That response is the confession. It reveals whether the individual feels supported or threatened, expanded or contracted. And because it is repeated daily, often dozens of times, it trains the nervous system into a familiar posture toward money. Changing this inner conversation does not require force or constant correction. In fact, force often amplifies resistance. What alters inner speech is the introduction of space. A pause. When the old reflex arises, silence interrupts it. That silence is not empty. It is a moment where identity is no longer being reinforced. Over time, these pauses weaken the old narrative and allow a new one to form naturally. This is why silent reactions matter more than spoken words. A calm pause where panic used to arise signals a shift in state. A neutral response where lack once dominated signals a loosening of identity. Inner speech begins to soften, then simplify, then quiet. And as it quiets, the emotional charge around money dissolves. When the inner conversation changes, the outer one follows effortlessly. Words become fewer, explanations fade. The need to justify disappears. Money responds to this shift not as a reward, but as a reflection. It mirrors the new state because the old signal is no longer being broadcast. And in that quiet, unobserved space where no one else hears you, the real conversation finally begins to change. Sats rewrites financial self-talk. There is a reason the struggle with money feels louder during the day and strangely quieter at night. As the body relaxes and the mind loosens its grip on control, the constant internal narration begins to soften. Defenses drop. Effort recedes. This threshold between wakefulness and sleep is where identity becomes pliable, not through force, but through receptivity. Neville Goddard referred to this condition as the state akin to sleep, not because it is mystical, but because it is functional. It is the moment when the conscious mind stops arguing for the old story. During the day, inner speech is reactive. It is shaped by stimuli, habits, and emotional memory. Prices, conversations, and obligations trigger reflexive responses that reinforce familiar states. At night, however, those triggers fade. The mind is no longer negotiating with the world. It is simply present. In this softened condition, whatever is felt as true sinks deeper, not as an idea, but as a sense of self. This is why sleep has always been associated with renewal. Identity quietly resets when resistance is low. Sats works not by correcting sentences, but by stabilizing a feeling of provision. The body does not understand words in the abstract. It understands states. When the feeling of being supplied is allowed to settle in the body before sleep, it imprints as normal. There is no effort involved, no repetition, no convincing. The feeling itself becomes familiar, and familiarity is what the subconscious accepts as reality. This is why short implication scenes are so effective in this state. Not dramatic visualizations, not fantasies of excess, but simple impressions that imply completion, the relief of a settled account, the ease of having handled something already, the quiet satisfaction of knowing it is done. These impressions dissolve old phrases without confronting them. The mind does not need to argue with "I can't afford it" when it is gently experiencing what it feels like to be beyond that sentence altogether. Over time, this nightly exposure does something subtle but profound. The default inner speech begins to change on its own. The old reflexive responses lose their emotional charge. Situations that once triggered contraction now register as neutral. The mind no longer rushes to explain, justify, or retreat. This is not because the person is suppressing thought, but because the underlying state has shifted. When identity changes, language follows effortlessly. Sleep is powerful precisely because the mouth finally shuts up. The constant internal commentary that dominates waking life cannot maintain itself in this softened condition. What remains is feeling, and feeling, in Neville's framework, is the creative act. When feeling provisioned becomes the last impression of the day, it carries through the night and sets the tone for the next morning. Waking life begins to reorganize around it without conscious intent. As this state stabilizes, money stops resisting, not because it is being summoned, but because the old signal has faded. The nervous system no longer broadcasts urgency or insufficiency. Inner speech grows quieter, simpler, more assured. And in that quiet continuity, the identity that once confessed lack dissolves naturally, replaced by one that no longer needs to speak about money at all. Money runs from need, not desire. There is a crucial distinction that is often overlooked in discussions about money, and misunderstanding it creates enormous confusion. Desire and need are not the same state, even though they are frequently treated as such. Desire is expansive. It is clean. It arises from interest, curiosity, and preference. Need, by contrast, is contracted. It is urgent. It is charged with fear and dependency. Money does not recoil from desire. It recoils from need, because need signals instability rather than intention. Need carries an unspoken message. Something is missing, and its absence threatens survival, identity, or safety. This message is not communicated through words alone. It is embedded in posture, tone, timing, and emotional urgency. When need is present, the nervous system is tense. Attention narrows. The mind fixates on outcomes. This fixation collapses flexibility and creativity, which are essential for circulation. Money, like opportunity, flows where movement is possible, not where pressure dominates. Desire, on the other hand, does not grasp. It does not plead, it does not chase. It simply recognizes something as appealing and assumes the possibility of having it. There is space around desire. There is patience. There is an underlying sense that life is cooperative rather than adversarial. This is why desire feels light, while need feels heavy. One trusts the future, the other fears it. An effective way to sense this difference is to observe how invitations work in ordinary life. Invitations are extended most easily to those who already seem comfortable attending, not because others are excluded intentionally, but because ease invites ease. Someone who appears desperate for inclusion creates tension, even if their desire is genuine. The same dynamic operates with money. Need announces insufficiency. Desire assumes availability. Neville Goddard consistently pointed out that assumption restores circulation. When provision is assumed, desire remains free of urgency. It does not have to justify itself. It does not have to demand immediacy. It simply exists as a natural movement of consciousness. In that state, money can approach without resistance because nothing is being pulled or forced. Need often disguises itself as motivation. People believe that urgency will propel them forward, that pressure will produce results. In reality, pressure compresses perception. It narrows the field of options and reinforces the very state that repels support. The more someone needs money, the more their inner world contracts around its absence. The more it contracts, the more life mirrors that contraction back to them. When need dissolves, something unexpected happens. Desire does not disappear. It becomes clearer. It becomes more precise and less emotional. There is no longer a sense of chasing or waiting. The individual feels internally settled, even before anything changes externally. This settled state is not passive, it is receptive, and receptivity is what allows movement. Money does not move toward those who are begging life to rescue them. It moves toward those who are already internally standing on solid ground. When assumed provision replaces need, circulation resumes naturally, not as a reward, not as a miracle, but as a reflection of a state that no longer repels it. Stop confessing poverty to life. Everything you have heard in this message leads back to a single, sobering truth. Inner speech is never casual. It is always self-definition. What you repeatedly say inwardly is not commentary about life. It is the position from which life responds. Neville Goddard made this clear when he taught that consciousness does not negotiate with words, but obeys assumptions. Money does not argue with explanations or sympathize with effort. It mirrors the state you consistently announce, silently or aloud, as who you are. When lack is spoken, even politely, it is accepted as identity. And once accepted, Behavior, perception, and opportunity quietly reorganize to remain consistent with it. This is why forcing affirmations rarely works. Identity is not changed by argument, but by assumption. Quiet assumption replaces tension. Silence replaces confession. What feels normal internally becomes inevitable externally. Modern science echoes the same principle. Joe Dispenza explains that repeated self-talk conditions the nervous system into automatic identity. What you rehearse becomes familiar. What becomes familiar becomes truth. Over time, the body lives from expectation, not intention.